Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream Public Media are made possible by PNC and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland, where we are devoted to conversations of consequence that help democracy thrive. It's Friday, April 26th, and I'm Maria Fosha, President and CEO of Lutheran Metropolitan Ministry. I'm pleased to introduce the 2024 Charles R.C. Annual Forum on Reentry, featuring Yusuf Dahl, CEO at the Century Promise. According to the 8-point plan for housing justice in Cuyahoga County, those with criminal records are 10 times more likely to experience homelessness, and those who are homeless are more likely to be arrested. This begins a vicious cycle for those with a record. These individuals face collateral sanctions, which are state laws and administrative rules that can limit a person's ability to find employment, housing, and more. In fact, the same 8-point plan cited that 78% of affordable rentals in the county had long-term bans on those convicted of even minor offenses. The result is that more than 20,000 people exiting incarceration in Cuyahoga County every year do not have access to a basic need that is vital for successful reintegration. Our speaker today, Yusuf Dahl, has been on both sides of the struggle to strengthen America's most vulnerable neighborhoods. As a teenager, he operated a network of drug houses before being sentenced to prison for 10.5 years. After his imprisonment, during the depths of the financial crisis, he became an unlikely real estate investor and affordable housing advocate. From a single two-family house in one of Milwaukee's poorest zip codes, Yusuf built a portfolio of over 200 residential and commercial units and founded an award-winning property management company. Yusuf is a former president of Wisconsin's largest apartment owners trade association and is leading the national effort to repeal the Thurman Amendment, legislation that imposes a lifetime denial of fair housing protections to persons with a drug distribution conviction. He holds an MPA from Princeton University and an MBA from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. First, we will hear from Yusuf, and then he will be joined by Stephanie Casanova, criminal justice reporter at Signal Cleveland, for a coffee table conversation. If you have a question for our speaker, you can text it to 330-541-5794. That's 330-541-5794, and City Club staff will try to work it into the Q&A portion of the program. Members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please join me in welcoming Yusuf Dahl.
There goes our clicker. That's all right. We're going to adapt to that. That's my clicker. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a tremendous privilege to be back in Cleveland. As some of you know, I'm originally from Milwaukee, and so I love to get back to the Midwest and come every time I can, except when it's winter. And then I try to avoid that. So I'm looking forward to our time together today. But before I begin, I'd just like to briefly acknowledge a few folks in the room. I'd like to thank LMM for all of their work in bringing this together, folks at the City Club for all of this work, and every other partner organization that's made today possible. I'd also like to acknowledge Charles C. And thank him for his years of service to this community. You know, I didn't realize, yes, please. I didn't realize how big of a deal Charles was until I posted this event on my LinkedIn and people started reaching out to me, but not to congratulate me for the keynote, but to say how much they admire Charles and his work. So let me provide just a quick roadmap of our time together for the next 20 minutes. I'm going to start by sharing a bit about who I am, a little bit about my story, and then I'm going to talk about the current state of affairs regarding housing access, and then I'm going to wrap up with some recommendations for both policymakers and advocates to move forward on this issue. But before I jump in, I just want to level set and explicitly frame the problem that we're going to be talking about today. Because when we talk about fair chance housing, your perspective on it is going to change depending on where you're sitting at the table. And for some, it's about housing discrimination and unfair housing denials. But for others, it's about the infringement on their discretion to make rental decisions regarding their property. Now, both perspectives have elements of truth, and we must take that under consideration as we put forward possible solutions. So a bit about me. As you've heard, I have the archetypal poverty to prison story that's far too common, especially in places like Cleveland. When I was 18 years old, I was sentenced to prison for 10 years for the distribution of drugs. And in the ensuing 25 years, I've been privileged to live a life that I could have never imagined as a child. I've worked on 3 continents as a software developer and have received prestigious fellowships, including one from Google. I was a full-time landlord in the city of Milwaukee for many years and had the privilege of serving as the president of the Wisconsin Apartment Association. That work had me involved in a lot of legislation in the state, and here's a picture, maybe you can identify me. This is typically the spaces I found myself in that capacity. But most importantly, I've been able to change the trajectory of my family. So when I was a teenager, I remember people saying, you know, you're going to end up in prison just like your father and your older brother. And I did. Today, when people meet my family, they ask my daughter if she's going to follow in my footsteps and attend Princeton University. That's the power of reentry, and that's the power of the work that all of us do in ensuring access to opportunity. It truly allows us to break the generational cycles of incarceration and poverty. So I want to be clear, the work that I had to achieve and that I had to do was not easy. People who know me often joke and they say that I have old man energy because I'm more likely to do something at 7 a.m. than 7 p.m. But I tell them it's because I spent all my young man energy when I was younger working nonstop. But for all of that work, and this is important, nothing that I've accomplished would have been possible if it wasn't for others being willing to look past the worst thing I did as a teenager and to see me as the person that I had become. So let's briefly explore the intersection of criminal justice, location, and opportunity. I'm going to start with the obvious. Location matters and determines so many facets of our life, from access to quality schools, access to employment, and even the approach and presence of policing in our community. In Cuyahoga County, like many places in the country, zip code drastically influences the likelihood of justice involvement. As we can see from this graph, there are places in this community where the likelihood of justice involvement increases dramatically depending on where you live. So this graph highlights the percentage of people who are incarcerated who were born to low-income parents. Red represents high levels of incarceration, and blue represents low levels of incarceration. And, you know, I'm from Milwaukee, so racial disparities don't shock me, but I have to tell you, I was floored to learn that there are neighborhoods in this community where upwards of 20% of young black kids born to poor parents end up incarcerated and have some level of justice involvement. That's systemic, and that's tragic. So we know that geography is correlated with justice involvement. And so it logically stands to reason that if a person is looking to turn their life around and to avoid the environments and the relationships that led to poor decisions in the past that perhaps they would want to move to a different neighborhood. Yet, as we all know, it's not that simple for people who have justice involvement. And that's because of the unfettered discretion we have given landlords when making rental decisions. Now, I want to be clear, when I suggest unfettered discretion is problematic, it's not because an owner or an operator is making a decision without the input of others. It's because there's no transparency into the process or the factors that the decision was based upon. And it's worth noting that such latitude is not common in many other life-altering contexts, such as employment and lending. Banks and employers have guidelines and oversight on how to exercise discretion regarding criminal records in the decision-making process. And from my perspective, deciding on where one can live is just as consequential, if not more so, than deciding on where one can work. So why were landlords given this discretion? And moreover, why are they so resistant to relinquish it, especially when it consistently rates below many other factors in the rental screening process, such as past evictions, income, rental history, credit score, etc.? Well, the answer to that is like a lot of dysfunctional things in this society, and that has to do with political opportunity.
One conviction is sufficient. My amendment simply says that one conviction is sufficient for a landlord to refuse to rent to a drug dealer. It's that simple. I urge my colleagues to vote for this amendment. Failure to do so makes the rights of law-abiding citizens meaningless. Drug dealers deserve no federal protection.
Does anyone in the room recognize that politician? Yeah. So we know what that's all about. And, you know, I've watched that video dozens of times, and it never ceases to amaze me that not a single senator stood up and challenged his gross generalizations or the implications of taking away fair housing protections for life for people with a single drug distribution conviction. But that was the zeitgeist of the moment. And through carrots and sticks, throughout the 80s and early 90s, lawmakers changed the norms around tenant screening. They put landlords at the front line of crime prevention through legislation, threats of property seizure, the promotion of eviction mechanisms like crime-free lease addendums, and the end result is what I refer to as reentry redlining. It's where criminal record screening became a tool to institutionalize housing denials for people with justice involvement and to essentially keep them out of certain neighborhoods. The impact of these types of policies is evident in places like Cuyahoga County, and a really interesting report came out in 2020 called A Never-Ending Sentence. If you have not looked at that report, take a look at it because it really highlights the impact of these policies right in this community. But that's only part of the story. After all, we can go on the nation's largest trade association's website and get the following statistics. We know that after 6 years, a past criminal record or past criminal involvement loses its predictive value. We know that most crimes are committed by young people. And we know that recidivism, when it happens, typically takes place within the first 3 years. So if we know all of these facts, we all agree on these facts, how is it that passing fair chance housing legislation has become such a difficult process? Well, for that, we can't blame politicians alone. Instead, we have to look to the field of cognitive psychology. Is anyone familiar with this book or the broader academic work around behavioral economics? When I was in graduate school, I had the opportunity to take a class with the late, great Danny Kahneman, who won a Nobel Prize for this work. And in one of his lectures, he explained a cognitive bias known as the endowment effect. And that's essentially where an individual tends to overvalue things that they possess simply because they possess them. So how does this relate to fair chance housing legislation? Well, simply put, we have given landlords complete discretion for so long that now that we're trying to roll some of that back, it feels like a vital tool of freedom is being taken away from them. Even though, as I just outlined, on their own trade association's website, we know that criminal records are a poor predictor of tenant success. It turns out that having absolute discretion to screen out tenants with criminal records is so important, in large part because they already have that ability. So what do we do as policymakers and advocates? Policymakers have incredibly challenging jobs, especially in large metropolitan areas. There just isn't sufficient resources to meet all of the needs and demands of citizens. Every day, they're forced to make tough decisions, and sometimes not knowing whether or not that was the right decision. Well, fair chance housing legislation is not one of those choices. If you use a common political framework or policy framework in determining when to deploy public resources to address private problems, we look to see if a market failure exists. And as such, requires government intervention to level the playing field. Well, when you view fair chance housing legislation through this lens, the policy choice is clear. Every day in this community, right here, where we are, people are denied housing solely based on a past criminal conviction that has very little predictive value. Creating fair chance housing legislation is not about taking away some inalienable right endowed to landlords by the Creator. It's about making the exercise of their discretion more deliberate and more transparent. And that's better for everyone in this room and in this community. The fact is, politicians of the past have manufactured this crisis for political gain. And it's up to our current political leaders to get us out of it. Several models of fair chance housing exist across the country, including in the state of New Jersey and in Cook County, Illinois. For advocates, I encourage you to continue to engage industry partners. Landlords are not a monolithic block, and we cannot allow the few to dominate the policy narrative on this issue. I would also encourage policymakers and advocates to understand that your fight is not just local, and to support efforts to realize justice housing nationally. As many of you know, I got into this work because of my own experience with housing denial. And despite all of my accomplishments in the ensuing 25 years with zero justice involvement, my family was not allowed to live where we wanted because of a piece of legislation known as the Thurman Amendment. Now, this is a chart of where I live in the city of Allentown, and it's income as adults for children who were born in different parts of the city. And the blue areas represent incomes that are above the median income. The red represents below the median income. Does anyone want to guess where I was allowed to live? The Thurman Amendment dictated the school my daughter could attend, the neighborhood amenities we had access to, and how close we were able to live to our support systems. By legally allowing lifetime housing denials, the Thurman Amendment not only anchors landlords to more restrictive and longer look-back periods, but it keeps our country tied to housing policies informed by the hysteria of the 1980s and the racial tropes that went along with it. Put simply, housing policy in 2024 in the United States of America should not be informed by people like Strom Thurmond. Cleveland is home to some of the largest landlords in the country, and we should be engaging them and enlisting them in this support for housing justice locally and across the country. Now, I'm going to end with an experience that I've actually been trying to process over the past couple of weeks, because it was really troubling for me. So I met with the head lobbyist for the largest apartment association in the country, right? So this woman's based out of DC. And I shared with her my effort to repeal the Thurmond Amendment, and I mentioned that I was heartened to see on her own website guidance encouraging landlords to do individualized assessments and this list of facts that highlighted that criminal records are poor predictors for tenant success. I shared that there was legislative momentum around removing this artificial barrier, and I said, hey, at best, it would be great to have your support, but at minimum, it would be wonderful if you stayed neutral as this legislation made its way through the halls of Congress. I wasn't prepared for what happened next. She said in her view, in her organization's view, the Thurmond Amendment is a vital tool for the operation of rental property in this country and is necessary to ensure tenant and building safety. When I reminded her of the data that was on her website and I shared additional facts about the arbitrary nature of this legislation, she paused and looked me in the eye and warned me that it was possible for things to go in the other direction, and that this amendment could possibly be expanded to enable landlords to ban people for life for other crimes as well. I had just shared with this woman how this legislation impacted my family and over 14 million people in this country. I reminded her of her own data that highlighted the gratuitously punitive nature of this legislation. And she responded by essentially threatening me to expand the reach of this barrier to impact even more vulnerable people. Y'all, the fight is not going to be easy. But each and every one of us in this room understands that we can, that we must, and that we will create a new paradigm of housing in this country. One where people who have paid their debt to society will have the ability to live where they want, not where they are allowed. Thank you.
Thank you for that. All right.
Thank you. Did I make Charles proud? That's all that matters. All right.
So you just shared a pretty heartbreaking story. And as we see time and time again, the data, the research, and sometimes even personal stories don't change minds. So just to give some people here some hope, what keeps you going despite all those roadblocks?
Well, I'd say a couple of things keep me going. One is that knowing that this experience happened to me, how many people does it happen to every day that do not have a voice and do not have a platform? And more importantly, I think about my own daughter, and I think about her education and how it's that very thing, education, which is going to allow her to have opportunities and break the cycle of incarceration and poverty that's plagued my family. So on that end, I know that this work has to be done, right? And if not me, who? The other piece is that, this conversation with the woman from DC notwithstanding, there's a lot of landlords who understand that things need to change. And so I've gotten a lot of support for this work at the state level. So the Wisconsin Apartment Association has endorsed this, not just because I used to run it. The Wisconsin Realtors have endorsed this. And we need to engage the associations in Ohio. And I'll note, and this was actually a little disheartening for me, I've given some variation of this talk across the country dozens of times. I have never done this engagement and not had a representative from a statewide or local apartment association on this stage with me. We tried for months. I actually reached out to a contact in DC to try to get someone local. And why aren't you on the stage with us? Well, I am so heartened, and we will definitely connect after. But I'll tell you, we want you up here because your perspective matters, and you have to be a part of this table as we solve these problems. Amen. And to be fair, and we'll definitely engage, but exactly that, and look, that's my advice to the advocates in this room. You would be shocked at the number of times I show up in a city to talk about this very issue, and I'll ask, okay, well, what's the landlord's perspectives? What's their position? And they haven't engaged them. And look, I recognize it's the same reason we watch CNN or we watch Fox News, depending on what our political views are, right? We prefer to be around folks who think and value the same things we do, but we have to cross that divide because at the end of the day, landlords and advocates have more in common than they have what separates them, and we have to collaborate together to solve this problem. So thank you for showing up.
If you haven't yet, I believe the Cuyahoga County Reentry Office has a committee and subcommittees, and one of those subcommittees is a group of landlords that are working to reduce these barriers and understand these problems. So if the people who spoke earlier have not yet connected to those committees, they should. And you kind of started going into what I was going to ask you next. What are some, as you do this work, what are some lessons you've learned and some just kind of mistakes you made along the way that you might want to warn the advocates in this room who are doing this work about?
I'll start with the latter, and the biggest mistake I made was underestimating how difficult this was going to be. So I'm a very logical person. And, you know, when this incident first happened to me, naively I thought, oh, this is some grave mistake. You know, how is it that in 2024 or 2023, when it happened, that we could have legislation on the books that makes it completely legal to ban someone for life for a decision that was made, you know, oftentimes as a teenager. And, you know, the Thurman Amendment applies to marijuana as well. So if you got caught with an ounce of pot 20 years ago, you have no fair housing protections. And so I underestimated what it takes to affect change at the national level. The state level, local level, it's a little bit different. But when you start talking about changing things in DC, it's as you can see, it's incredibly disheartening. So that was one thing I underestimated. And one thing I learned, and I know a lot of the advocates in this room are already focused on this, is the power of data and telling your stories. And so I was able to pull all drug distribution convictions in the state of Wisconsin from the enactment of the Thurman Amendment all the way up to 2023, okay? Someone guess what percentage of cocaine distribution charges were for 5 grams or less. And just because I'm hoping most of you don't know how much cocaine that is, I'm hoping. That's not a lot. That is typically associated with personal consumption, okay? So I'd love to hear, what percentage do you think of people who had this conviction, lost their fair housing protections for life, was for an amount of drugs that's typically considered personal consumption? Okay, so I've heard 95, I heard 65, 60% is the answer. So ask yourself, okay, how is it that 60% of the people who have this conviction that leads to a permanent loss of housing protections for an amount of drugs that should be considered personal consumption? Well, we can infer a couple of things. One, these folks probably did not have resources for adequate legal representation, right? Let's be honest. And 2, they likely lived in a community that was incredibly aggressive from the policing and the enforcement side of their community. And so, it's incredibly arbitrary. And so that's the story that I take with me when I engage not only policymakers, but landlords, advocates, everything. We have to know the facts. And so if you haven't pulled that data in Ohio, and I had to do a special records request, you might have to as well, but that data is out there, and you need to be able to bring that along with you with your stories.
So you mentioned the power of personal stories. You touched on yours a little bit, but I'm really curious. Collateral sanctions don't just affect your ability to rent, right? They affect your ability to buy property, to get a loan, to build credit. So on like a personal level, how did you do it? How did you become a landlord when you had those barriers? Or are they different in Wisconsin than they are in Ohio?
No, the collateral consequences, the systemic challenges, it's the same across the country. I was able, everything I've accomplished, I don't want anyone in this room, especially if it's a young person and maybe has some justice involvement, I don't want you to think I did this alone. I don't want you to think it was just an issue of working hard. And best believe I worked incredibly hard, but it was opportunity that was extended to me by other people. And how I got involved in real estate is I was looking for an apartment, and I called this guy up, an ad on Craigslist or whatever, and he showed me a bunch of apartments in the city of Milwaukee. And I said, wow, you must really be doing well if you own all these properties. And he said, oh yeah, real estate is the best. Everyone should own real estate. You should own real estate. But there were 2 problems. One, I didn't have any money. and 2, when you met this guy, you could tell there was something about him. Right? He just had a certain ability, intelligence, a gift that just because that person had it didn't mean you had it. And so I just sat on it for a little bit. And then what changed is a couple of months later, he sent his brother over to pick up his rent. And 2 things about that encounter. One, his brother owned property and had nowhere near the abilities that this other guy did. And 2, his brother drove a Lexus. I said, that's it. I'm in. If this guy can do it, I can do it for sure. And so I started volunteering with this guy on the weekends and the evenings, working on his property, learning the business. Because at the time, I didn't know anything about housing, right? My father wasn't there. I spent most of my juvenile and young adult years in prison. And so I just worked really hard. I did every task he asked me to do as if I was being paid for it. And eventually he took me from, working on the house to going to look at properties with him. And, would show me the underwriting he was doing. And when it was time for me to buy my first property, he borrowed me the $5,000 that I needed additionally, plus the money I had saved to close on my first property. So, and that's just the example in housing, but if you want to talk about how I managed to become a software developer, go to print, same story, just different people. Folks saw me and they looked past a poor decision I made as a teenager and they saw me and valued me as the person that I was at that moment.
Part of it is just luck and meeting the right people.
Listen, luck plays a big part in so many things, and I think we all need to keep that in mind, and it helps instill a level of humility in us, because there's a lot of folks who work just as hard as I did, and they're not up here right now.
So a lot of these fair chance housing programs, they tend to, on top of taking a very long time to be implemented to break down these barriers, they tend to exclude people, right? They exclude people with F4s, F5s, more violent offenses, some sex offenses. Have you seen any, legislation that does better about not letting these people fall through the cracks?
Well, so there's a couple of models to look at. The folks in New Jersey, I think, have done a wonderful job, and they have a great apartment association leadership team in New Jersey. Happy to connect folks here. I know I made that offer last time to the folks at the county, but we're going to make it again. I'm happy to connect you with those folks. And they have a thoughtful look-back period. And again, the look-back period isn't necessarily binding. Right? A landlord still has that discretion to say, okay, this crime happened only 2 years ago. It's within the look-back period. And in addition to, evaluating your rental history, credit score, blah, 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 we're going to go with someone else. But it establishes cutoff periods where after a certain period of time, after 2 years or whatever it is, and, you were caught with drugs, we're not going to value that in this rental screening process. And it's such common sense because, like I noted in my presentation, talk to any landlord, talk to any association. What is the most important factor that you're thinking about when you're evaluating this applicant to be successful in your property? And it's not, did you have justice involvement 5-10 years ago? It's what's your income? What's your rental history? Those types of things. So honestly, you'll never, we talked about this yesterday. I got a chance to meet some of the board members of LMM, and I said this whole situation makes my head hurt because it's not that difficult. It's not that difficult, and I really hope when I come back to Cleveland a year from now, we have some effective legislation on the books that extends opportunity to people who've paid their debt to society.
What do you wish people understood about people with past felony convictions? There's a lot of stigma out there. How do we break it?
I think that stigma is breaking itself because so many people have just been ensnared in the criminal justice system. One of my biggest supporters in this effort to repeal the Thurman Amendment is the head of the Wisconsin Realtors Association. Really nice guy. I worked with him when I ran the apartment association. But he disclosed to me the other day on a phone call, he said, my brother did cocaine. And I have another brother who just never got it on track and ended up making a bad decision and spending some time in prison, but not for a drug-related offense. So the fact of the matter is, I would wager everyone in this room has some proximity to somebody who's had some level of justice involvement. I would be shocked. In fact, come up to me afterwards if you don't know anybody who has not been impacted by the criminal legal system. And so, there's another cognitive bias known as the actor-observer bias. You all should check out that book by Danny Kahneman. But there's another cognitive bias known as the actor-observer bias. And basically what it says is that when it's somebody we don't know and they make a mistake, we attribute it to some personal failing, right? Oh, that person is just a bad person. The person was born to be a criminal. That person is evil. But when that same mistake is made by somebody we know or have some proximity to, we attribute it to external factors. He's in a tough neighborhood. Johnny was in the army and then blah, blah, blah. So the fact is, as this system has grown, it's just naturally broken down some of these stereotypes and barriers. So I'm confident that, at least when we talk about criminal record-related screening, we should be able to sit down the table from across from each other, and we should be able to come up with some solutions, because it's in everybody's best interest in Cuyahoga County for people to be able to turn their lives around and break the cycle of incarceration and poverty that is plaguing this community.
Thank you. All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Will Tarter. I'm the Director of Advocacy at Lutheran Metropolitan Ministry. And what you heard is an opportunity to follow up on this conversation. We're going to loop in the Director of Programming at the City Club so we can follow up on that conversation we had earlier with the association. So thank you, Yusuf, for that. So stay tuned, all right? We're about to begin the audience Q&A. For our live stream and our radio audience, or for those who are just joining me at the City Club is Yusuf Dahl, the CEO of the Century Promise, talking about removing barriers to housing after incarceration. Moderating the conversation is Stephanie Casanova, criminal justice reporter at Signal Cleveland. We welcome questions from everyone, City Club members, guests, students, and those joining via our live stream at cityclub.org. Or the radio broadcast at 89.7 WKSU Idea Stream Public Media. If you'd like to text a question for our speaker, please text it to 330-541-5794. That's 330-541-5794, and City Club staff will try to work it into the program. May we have our first question, please?
Sure. I'm going to share one of our text questions that we received. The Thurmond Amendment has disproportionate impact on African Americans because of racist justice system. Could it be challenged on those grounds? Thank you.
I don't think that you would win a legal argument that is disproportionately impacting people of color, and it is, just because there's nothing explicit in the actual enactment of the law. It's not the law itself that's discriminatory, it's the implementation of that law. And so just to give you one example of this, going back to this Wisconsin data I have, and that's why you have to get this data in Ohio. We have to get this data across the country because it's hard to dispute the impact, the discriminatory impact of this type of legislation when you have it. And so people of color are 5 times more likely to be charged with a distribution charge with 1 gram or less of cocaine than white people. And I'm really just trying to wrap my head around that. I still don't have this answer to that, but if it's 1 gram of cocaine, what does it matter? Like it's one, so if you're white or black, it should be the same charge. And if there was only a minor variance, I would just attribute it to, the way a judge didn't like his breakfast that morning or something, or the DA. But when you have that level of disparity, it really speaks to, well, first of all, it's Strom Thurmond, so we know what the intent was. So we only have to, I guess, question that. But nonetheless, it should move us, all of us, to say that regardless of the intent, the actual outcome has been discriminatory, and we just need to move past it. Because, and as I tell the conservative folks, y'all want to move to a race-blind society, so do I, but then let's deal with some of these things that are disproportionately harming communities of color.
Good afternoon again, Yusuf. Ronnie Cannon of Towards Employment. In this room, you have a number of individuals that are currently facing the plight of unfair housing practice. If you will, if you can offer some words of encouragement or wisdom to the person that's feeling despair of not being able to get adequate housing, please.
Well, and this is going to be applicable to not just housing challenges. Because you're going to face employment challenges. You're going to face credit challenges. There's going to be no shortage of challenges you are going to face. But I genuinely believe, and I'm telling you this because I truly believe it, okay? that if you continue to pound on the door for opportunity and you just refuse to leave, and if no one answers, you go through the window, your break is going to come. I promise you. I promise you, if you consistently show up, okay? If you consistently show up and show up with intention, show up with a sense of urgency, are you going to get every opportunity you want? No. Heck, I was just denied a White House fellowship. What the hell? You know what I mean? Like, well, how are you going to deny me? But it happens. But you keep showing up. And I assure you, that opportunity will come, and when it comes, you're going to be able to put a lot of things behind you, and it's going to be moving upward and onwards.
Good afternoon. My name is Lou, and homeless individuals stay in the shelter and helping all the unhoused population to get back to their feet. So the question for you is, will this national federal legislation can really help to prevent any state or local legislation to go against it? You know they are very smart. They can go around it. Don't forget, Ohio is one of the 5 states. Today, any landlord can refuse your rent just because it's $1 short or 1 day late. So there are so many ways they can get you. Is there any way to strengthen this particular legislation on the federal level to prevent state and local legislation to go against it in any other sneaky way? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, local legislation is going to trump matters of like fair housing. I mean, so the way it works with fair housing is there's like a base set of protected characteristics and classes at the federal level, and then at the state, local level, you can add to that. But you know, the type of legislation you're talking about isn't necessarily fair housing related. It's other types of legislation, and you know, I mean, that's why you just have to have dialogue. And you know, these issues are complex. I mean, there's no doubt about it. These issues are complex, and that's why we have to have organizations that are serving as intermediaries, that are helping us navigate this process. And, you know, we just have to do the best we can. But I wish I had like a silver bullet for you for these types of situations, but it's hard work, and we're all going to have to show up every day and do that hard work.
Hello, Greg Reeves from Towards Employment. This is kind of a two-part question. One, does a landlord have to tell you why they denied you? And if they don't have to tell you why, how do you know that's the reason?
Yeah, so you're going to get, at least in my case, depends on the service that a landlord might use. A lot of times landlords increasingly are using third-party screening services. They're cost-effective, they're quick, and they will typically state on the letter why you were denied housing. Now, the problem oftentimes is that, and you're seeing this with the bigger institutional landlords, is you'll get the denial letter, and like in my case, it said, if you take issue with this decision, call this number. Well, I'm in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and the number was in Boston, Massachusetts. And after spending a half hour getting nowhere on the phone, I had to secure housing. We had to make other decisions. If it's a local landlord, it's going to be a lot different. And quite frankly, a lot of local landlords aren't enforcing this type of, you know, grossly punitive discretion in legislation. So it's all going to depend on the landlord, and you're going to have that more impersonal call this number out of state from the institutional players. Local landlords are typically going to have a local office that you can call and actually talk to somebody.
Good afternoon. I appreciate you being here. When you look at the research of what's happening, a lot of the recidivism, well, the ability to read can cut down a lot on the recidivism rate. And when you were during your 10 years, did you see any efforts to help struggling readers? Because the percentage is very high, the illiteracy rate is very high. So I'm not really asking about the housing, but when you get out, if you can't read, then you're certainly not going to be able to stand up for your rights. So did you see efforts when you were doing the 10 years to really help struggling readers?
Yeah, so my situation was certainly unique compared to today. When I arrived yesterday, I went to LMM and got to meet with some of their participants in the Chopping for Change program. And I said to myself, my God, if I would have had access to something like that, it would have been a huge leg up for me when I was released. But I was sentenced to prison 25 years ago, if not more. So it was a very different paradigm and model. And in fact, I don't know if this happened in Ohio, it probably did. Wisconsin was sending so many people to prison, they couldn't even house them. They sent me to Oklahoma. So, you've heard of the prison industrial complex, and we all know everything's a business. Well, a private prison is really a business. They make no effort to try to hide that fact. And so there was very, very little services provided when I was incarcerated, at least in the facility I was in. But I'm with you 100%. It's an opportunity when people, that's why I love what they're doing with the Chopping for Change program, is that it's actually taking place while people are still incarcerated.
My name is Mr. Curry. I've come where you've been. I represent the men on the mission from the city mission. And it's hard, like you said, it's hard, and it's not going to be easy. So we, as a group in City Mission, we appreciate everything that that they provide for us to get back into society on the right track. However, like you said, it's going to be hard. Background checks, housing background checks. So where we're at right now is in a position where they do all that they can for us, and all the support that we get. I think it's a team thing, and it's a unit. So they say numbers are stronger than numbers, so I appreciate it. Thank you for your service.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
So thank you to Yusuf Dahl and to Stephanie Casanova for joining us at the City Club today. Forums like this one are made possible thanks to generous support from individuals like you. You can learn more about how to become a guardian of free speech at cityclub.org. Today's forum is part of the City Club's Criminal Justice Series, thanks to the Shar and Chuck Fowler Family Foundation. It is also the 2024 Charles R.C. Forum on Reentry in partnership with Lutheran Metropolitan Ministry. For 44 years, Charles R.C. worked to support and advocate for people returning to the community after incarceration. Supporting returning citizens through workforce development, public policy, and advocacy remains a major priority for LMM to this very day. It is in Charles C.'s honor that the City Club hosted today's forum to highlight nationally recognized efforts and individuals working in reentry. Mr. C. and his family are here with us today, and we would like to acknowledge and thank him for his support. Thank you. We'd like to also welcome students at the tables from MC Squared STEM High School and Wycliffe High School. We'd also like to welcome guests at the tables hosted by Capital Partners, Community West Foundation, Cuyahoga County Office of Reentry, Charles C., Lutheran Metropolitan Ministry, the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District, the Shar and Chuck Fowler Family Foundation, the Fair Housing Center, the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland, the Ohio Organizing Collaborative, and Towards Employment. Just announced at the City Club on Tuesday, April 30th, Barb McQuaid, former U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan and professor from practice at the University of Michigan Law School, will join us as part of Law Day to talk about her new book, Attack from Within: How Disinformation is Sabotaging America. And then on Friday, May 3rd, we will hear from leadership from the 4 Cleveland nonprofits who received transformational gifts in the latest round of Mackenzie Scott's donations: Birthing Beautiful Communities, LGBT Community Center of Greater Cleveland, Towards Employment, and Fairfax Renaissance Development Corporation. You can get your tickets and learn more about these City Club forums and others at cityclub.org. And that brings us to the end of today's forum. Thank you once again to Yusuf and Stephanie, and to our members and friends of the City Club. I'm Will Tarter. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream Public Media are made possible by PNC and the United Black Fund of Greater Cleveland, Incorporated.